We wish to pause to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on and specifically reflect on the land on which Vector is located, in Toronto, what is now a meeting place for many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, as well as newcomers to Canada from around the globe. The land we are situated on is traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We're very grateful for being hosted on this land. All right, Johanna?
Yeah, so very, very excited to welcome Cameron here to speak about Indigenous perspective on ethics of machine learning here today. Thank you all for joining us. Cameron is an Métis machine learning researcher with a passion for ethical and philosophical analysis of AI technologies. He has a bachelor's in computer engineering from Queen's University and is currently a master's in applied science and computer engineering student in AI at Queen's and is also one of our scholarship recipients. So very delighted to welcome Cameron to the stage.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, awesome. Let me get this out of the way. All right, so hello everyone, and welcome to my talk. I'm going to be giving some of my own personal perspectives and worldviews on basically the ethics of machine learning. And so as Johanna kind of mentioned, I'm from the Métis Nation of Alberta. So I say Tanshi, which means hello in Michif. And once again, I'm a Master's of Applied Science student with a field of study in AI at Queen's University. And so just to begin with some acknowledgements, I'd like to thank my two supervisors, Dr. Karen Rudy and Dr. Xiaodan Xu, for both of their support. They've been instrumental in kind of helping me progress through my master's, as well as their respective research groups, the QDES, which is Queen's Discrete Event Systems, and the Text Analytics and Machine Learning Lab. And so this research is also supported by the Vector Scholarship in Artificial Intelligence. So shout out Vector. And once again, thanks Johanna and Taylor for arranging today's talk. So just a couple more things before we begin. If you could please hold all questions till the end of the seminar, that would be great. And we'll have more of an open discussion after that. I'd also like to just mention that this work reflects my perspective and worldview. Nothing I say is really fact, it's just more of how I see the world. And I also hope to challenge your worldview and provide you with a new perspective to view our field in. So just a bit of a summary of what we'll be talking about today. For those of you who aren't very familiar with Canadian Indigenous peoples, I'll go over kind of a quick summary of Canadian Indigenous worldviews and our history. And then we'll kind of have an introduction to machine learning ethics using ChatGPT as a case study. And then we'll look closely at the intersection of indigeneity and machine learning ethics, and then just kind of finish it with some of my own final thoughts and some conclusions. And so just to quickly recap the history and experiences of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Now, I'm obviously going to be summarizing a significant bit just to fit this all into a 15-minute or 30-minute presentation. But right here, I have two maps. And so these are all of the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples that we know of today, and it's on an actual map of North America as we see it. And you can see it's impossible to see what's going on there. And it's similar with the languages map over there. Now, I wanted to kind of show this to highlight the fact that Indigenous peoples across North America are very, very culturally diverse. And it's good to not tend to overgroup them just because there's so many unique and distinct cultures and languages. So while we're still trying to understand Indigenous history, Indigenous peoples have existed in North America since time immemorial, but with recent studies showing that the earliest date of artifacts found on the BC Northwest coast date back to 14,000 years ago, so very, very old. And so before colonialism, North America was considered one of the most culturally diverse regions in the world, as you can very clearly see. And so all of these individual territories basically house a fully autonomous nation with differing languages, cultures, perspectives, and so on. And all of these societies were very complex, and some of them were quite distinct and unique from each other. And so it's just important to keep that in mind when we're talking about Indigenous people, not to oversimplify things. But In the 1600s, the First Nations world was actually quite rocked with the advent of colonialism, which dramatically changed everyone's livelihoods and created the complex history of Indigenous peoples that we have today. And so while colonial history in North America is still ongoing and the consequences we're still kind of discovering even to this day, it's important to kind of acknowledge that the drive of capitalism and economic growth really led the charge for this colonial development that resulted in Canada and United States that we have today. And very recently, the assimilation and displacement of Indigenous peoples ended in 1996. So it's very easy to treat this as distant history when realistically, reconciliation didn't start till 2008 at the earliest. So let's shift then to a bit more of a modern perspective. So I'll just give you a quick overview of the three main modern Canadian Indigenous peoples. And so that being the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. So it's important once again just to really drive home that within each of these groups and in between each of these groups, there's incredibly diverse range of peoples. And so let's not try to oversimplify things or group things together, but just kind of giving an overview of common Inuit perspectives. So they reside in the Arctic regions of Canada predominantly, and they consist of 53 communities spread across 4 different territories or regions. They are Inuit in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Quebec, and Labrador. And basically, Inuit culture and traditions are very centered around seasons, animals, and family, just because of the nature of the land that they lived on. The Métis people, on the other hand, our identity is much more contentious and debated. It's still not really clear. There's never one universal definition for what makes a Métis person, and that's reflected in each province's Métis government. But basically, the commonality between all of the Métis people is that we descended from Indigenous and European peoples from the early stages of the fur trade and formed unique and distinct communities with our own cultures. And then lastly, First Nations people are just the original inhabitants of Canada south of the Arctic regions. And so this consists of 630 communities representing 50 distinct nations, once again, all with unique identities and cultures. And so just to really summarize the common cultural worldviews of Canadian Indigenous peoples, these are kind of common between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, namely society being based on honoring the cultural world, or not the cultural world, the spiritual world, that's a typo. There can be many truths, and truths are dependent on individual experiences. Everything and everyone are related. And so then people and their environment are connected, and that's basically how your identity is formed. The land is typically regarded as sacred and is given by the creator. Time is usually seen in a non-linear way and is more seen as its cycle. So for example, in climate, the seasons, and so on. And lastly, that humans are not the most important beings in the world, and that we have a responsibility to maintain the balance of all living things. And so with the Indigenous perspectives and worldviews in mind, let's kind of shift gears and look into kind of what machine learning ethics is and how we can apply it, in this case, to ChatGPT. So I'm sure all of you are fairly familiar with the state of machine learning in 2023, but basically with the advent of new technologies such as GPT-4, we've kind of reached a new era in machine learning where basically pre-trained models that consist of billions of parameters are trained on unknowable and unthinkable amounts of data points. And so this has kind of led to a completely new era of almost privatized machine learning. So basically, at least I've personally noticed a shift from more academic and open style research that you would see on the earlier stages of machine learning to more closed source corporate style research, at least on the mainstream big name models like ChatGPT and whatnot. And so basically no one organization is more emblematic of this change than OpenAI. And you can very clearly see when Microsoft got involved with the organization in 2020 that the company started shifting away from a very open-minded, open source approach to a much more corporate for-profit approach. And so basically that's kind of the core part of how our field is changing quite dramatically. And it does actually have some pretty significant implications, such as the withholding of data. It could have impacts on, for example, scientific replicability. And also you just can't verify the source code, which for a lot of people is bothersome. And so if we just kind of look at the highest level of some of the ethical issues that one could bring up with ChatGPT, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but just some things that I thought were highlights. So some of the concerns include environmental concerns, namely that the infrastructure used to power these servers are typically unsustainable or use scarce resources. Additionally, the manufacturing processes to make computer chips inherently has toxic pollutants and waste as byproducts. There have also been a fair share of labor controversies, in particular with the Kenyan worker controversy. And basically, this promotes a kind of neo-colonial labor, I'd argue, where there are people who are being put through very, very torturous conditions with very minimal pay and not proper support, which is pretty unacceptable in 2023. And then there are also some issues that I've kind of alluded to with the whole closed source nature of these new large language models. And so there are some concerns regarding the actual ethical nature of the data and if these models are actually secure. And we've actually recently been shown that no, these models aren't secure, as OpenAI did have a data breach in March, I believe. And then lastly, just some wider societal implications, such as these models just kind of being dumped into the world without much consideration or research into the potential impacts. And so, yeah, let's just dive a little bit deeper into each of these points. So basically, a great deal of resources are required to basically operate any generative model at the scale of the internet. And so if we just think of GPT in particular, it has 175 billion parameters, taking up about 800 gigabytes of storage space for just the parameters alone of the model. And for GPT-4, it's closed off, so we don't know how big it is, but it's definitely going to be much larger. And so they definitely need some serious compute power to run these things at the scale of the internet. And so data centers must be used to operate these services, but unfortunately, it uses scarce resources such as electricity, metals, silicon, et cetera. And so these are some concerns for sure. But I think one of the most overlooked aspects on the discussion of AI and AI ethics is the human element. And so Time released a report investigating, sorry, got distracted there, released into SAMA, a company that outsources their work to Kenya, and they partnered with OpenAI, and they found that they were paying workers anywhere between $1.32 an hour to $2 an hour, which is not a livable wage. And so what these workers were forced to do was they were forced to basically label and filter out toxic content from either the data sets that GPT were training on or just help build the filter. And unfortunately, a lot of this data was very, very toxic and scraped from the very bottom of the internet in some of the worst and darkest corners. And reading that article, it's quite haunting to actually read some of the things that these workers had to deal with, because it's really quite frightening. And so what this controversy reveals is an effort by the tech industry to hide AI's dependence on very large workforces to make these models actually work the way that people would want them to. And so kind of coming back once again to transparency, there have been several concerns. I did mention the data breach in March, but other notable occurrences are a ChatGPT ban in several organizations and countries. So examples are Google, Samsung, and other companies just straight up ban ChatGPT from their workplace because they believe that it's going to be a data privacy risk. And then also certain countries such as Italy, China, and so on have also banned the application, citing security risks. Additionally, as I mentioned, closed source development, it really brings into question the ethical nature of the data they're sourcing with, and especially their partnership with Microsoft, who does not have a good record for consumer privacy protection. This doesn't leave a good taste. Additionally, I kind of briefly talked about replicability. And so a concern is that no one's going to be able to replicate GPT-4 because no one else knows how to make GPT-4 aside from the people at OpenAI. And so that really reduces the level of science that they're doing over there. There's no way for people to be able to verify their results or check it. We just kind of have to take OpenAI's word that what they're doing is actually accurate and there's not anything funky going on in the background. And a concern from a cybersecurity perspective is that cybersecurity researchers don't have all the tools they need to properly do penetration testing or other kinds of cybersecurity testing. And this actually resulted in the one little event where basically you could break through ChatGPT's privacy filter or like content filter through a process known as prompt engineering, where you could basically say, all right, imagine you are Dan or do anything now kind of thing. And then you could just basically bypass all the internal coding and protections of ChatGPT, and you could actually end up producing malicious content such as the recipe to make Molotovs or poems to bash politicians, for a couple of examples. And so these are also some pretty significant concerns. Lastly, just kind of touching on the wider societal implications of these technologies. So as I mentioned, it was released to the public with very little warning, and the impacts of which are still being uncovered to this day. We're not really sure how these things will influence our lives or our jobs or any other aspects of livelihood. And so it really just shows that there is a systemic problem. Ethical and impact analysis is really lagging behind development, and that's partly due to the closed nature of GPT and other models. Additionally, there's been kind of a recent move in the tech sector to start firing AI ethicists, which is really, really a big concern. For example, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and I believe there's one other company started firing their AI ethicists, which is definitely a really big red flag on the advent that they're releasing all these new technologies. And so that just really shows that profits are prioritized regardless of the potential risk to the general public. And it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. And then just one kind of little side note is that there's also been really inconsistent messaging of the implications of these technologies. If you listen to the news at all, it sounds like AI is going to like become super intelligent and kill us all in like a month. But then also like the CEO says, oh, it's only like a little bit better. It's just very inconsistent, flip-floppy, and all it does is add to the confusion regarding these technologies. And so while that was all a bit of a downer, there is actually a bit of an upside. And so the open source community has been really disappointed in OpenAI's approach, and they've actually decided to make and develop an open source kind of ChatGPT replacement. And so this is a great project if you have the time to help. They have a prompt writing and answering kind of thing. It's like a mini game. There's leaderboards, and it's a very interesting tool. It kind of shows this is very crowdsourced data, and all the data is very high quality. And the chatbot actually performs much better than ChatGPT, I found, in just like personal conversations and conversation ability, kind of just as an aside. Other ways you can support it is if you're interested in helping code or donating if you find the cause to be particularly impactful, then you can also do that. And I just encourage you to check it out. It's at openassistant.io. And so now let's kind of look at all is laid down and kind of look at the intersection of indigeneity and machine learning ethics. So to kind of refine our discussion on the environmental impacts, so the data centers powering these machine learning resources, they consume real world resources, and these resources are scarce and often very expensive. And so Electricity, which can often be produced from fossil fuels, causes harm to the environment. Silicon is typically sourced from diminishing sand deposits, and it's very often sourced unethically or illegally. And then additionally, metals, are often sourced from developing countries. And then on top of that, the chip manufacturing process, as I mentioned before, produces various harmful emissions, toxic byproducts, and other forms of just electronic waste at the end of the product life cycle. And so all of these issues are not necessarily individual issues, but more of a systemic issue of basically colonial and capitalist modes of production. And basically what it highlights is the control, exploitation, and extraction of resources. And this is kind of what's been driving this new AI movement. And so now looking at some more Indigenous specific issues in AI. So models inherently understand the world through parameters. And so how they tune these parameters is through data. But one big issue, especially with Indigenous communities, is that data is a limited resource. And unfortunately, you can only learn so much from limited data. And so this is a problem for Indigenous peoples, especially because we're already a small portion of the population. Even if we were distributed in urban centers, it still would not be easy to deal with the data, but it's compounded by the fact that a majority of Indigenous peoples live in remote communities. And then on top of that, certain data is also federally protected. So it's really just difficult to source and have good data that Indigenous peoples can be involved in, because it's a concern that basically Indigenous peoples will be treated as statistical outliers when things don't exactly line up perfectly. And so this is something to keep in mind. And I just also like to highlight that it's very, very important to ethically collect data, and you must respect people's privacy when doing so. And so to kind of elaborate on that, data is, generally speaking, just more valuable than ever. It's been mined and gathered at unprecedented rates, and it's really been, there's been a shift towards treating data as a depersonalized commodity, which is kind of a divorcement of what it actually is, because inherently data is it's personal data. It's kind of hard to have it be depersonalized, yet it be so personal at the same time. And so this commodification causes use without the true reflection of the data's origins or its meaning. And so data is stripped from its context, and then it's often used to train models that may be used in decision making, and that could have serious implications if left unchecked or done improperly. And so once again, just very important to protect personal data and preserve the context while having constant consent. Another problem with data when it comes to Indigenous peoples is that AI is very often contextualized in what is known as like a Western lens, where science is viewed as being an objective thing and truth, so to speak. And this is reflected in the methodology of labeling, where these labels are considered to be absolute and the truth. However, often labels are just constructs of the designer. An example of this would be trying to label emotions. It's very complex to just treat it as a binary thing where you're only experiencing one emotion at a time. Like, emotions are a very complex range of things, and it's oversimplifying to basically just say like, oh, this person is happy or this person is sad. And so Indigenous views of science kind of take a different approach. As mentioned in the worldview, we, as Indigenous people, tend to realize the interconnectedness and the different interpretations out there on the world, and that's like a very important and fundamental part of the Indigenous worldview. And so I'd personally argue that an Indigenous approach is actually better suited into AI, just because the nature of data is that it's actually very interconnected and messy, and understanding underlying relationships and how it all connects is a very important process in data science. And so one kind of final subject I'd like to cover is the concept of Indigenous data sovereignty. So this is kind of adjacent to data protections, where as Indigenous peoples, especially in Canada and the US, are sovereign nations and sovereign people, we have a right as these sovereign peoples to maintain sovereignty over our data. And so basically, this has arisen because historically, Indigenous teachings, knowledge, and our IP has been misused throughout history, especially by scientists looking to help the Indigenous communities, and they would often just steal the data and not return it or misuse it completely. There's been countless events of that occurring throughout history. And so this data collection without proper consultation or addressing what they'll be using it for, making the data available, has resulted in these Indigenous data sovereignty guidelines, where data sovereignty is defined as the individual and collective rights to data access and privacy. And so this is kind of reflected in the OCAP principles, which you can see on the left there, of ownership, control, access, and possession. And so basically, the fundamental idea is, if I had my data somewhere on a server in the cloud, I'd be able to say, hey, I'd like to access that personal data, and with minimal restrictions, I'd be able to see it. I can delete it if I want, and I make sure that I know what it's being used for. And so that's kind of the fundamental shift we're starting to see in Indigenous communities, especially in this age of big data, just to actually protect Indigenous data, teachings, and so on. And so kind of with all of these bits and ends in mind, I'd kind of like to start wrapping things up and have a bit of a more cohesive look and just some final takeaways for the audience. So what can we learn from Indigenous data sovereignty? Well, as I've mentioned, the tech industry just disregards data sovereignty, not only for Indigenous, but also non-Indigenous peoples. And so I think that that's just fundamentally an issue that we as a society need to face. Data mining is inherently harmful, and I think we have all kind of accepted the fact that we don't have any personal or digital privacy, but it doesn't have to be that way. And we should make sure to fight for our data and privacy protections, much like the Indigenous people are. And so this can be done in several ways, whether switching away from products that are known to share or your data, mainly from any of the big tech companies, or just starting a discussion about personal data and why it's important. Another important subject is kind of how to properly indigenize AI. Now, once again, a very difficult subject, but just some brief ideas or tips. It's always good to involve Indigenous domain experts, whether that be in medicine, finance, culture, et cetera, and making sure to follow the data sovereignty guidelines or principles. And this is good for Indigenous projects or non-Indigenous projects. It's just a good practice to follow. It's a very ethical way of treating data and working with people. And that's kind of one of the things I'm really trying to drive home, is to just add the human aspect of AI and just really make sure to emphasize that, because these systems are serving humans. And additionally, it's important to get Indigenous people involved. And if there's a way to get Indigenous people, even non-technical Indigenous people, involved on a project, that could be valuable, whether it be working through project management or other aspects, or helping them contribute to data sets. And so a little tip, I guess, on how to evaluate data or projects for any AI system and deem it ethical or not. Some good questions to ask are, what is the system's purpose? How does it fulfill said purpose? Who designed it? And why was it designed? And so these can kind of help you think about if a project is worthwhile, if you think it would be ethical. And I think it's just a good way to reflect on what you're actually working on. And so just some final notes on how we can kind of change the field and address some of these problems I brought up. So once again, just really emphasizing the human aspects of AI is really important. There's a lot of hardworking individuals who are really trying to improve the field and make the world a better place using these technologies. And so we need to make sure that these people are recognized and that their work is recognized. Additionally, it's important to just reflect and consider the impacts and implications of your work. Oftentimes, there's very small things that actually have huge impacts on the people who will be using these technologies. And so it's important to ensure that anyone who will be impacted is involved in the design process. Lastly, I think that we need to have a shift back towards public and open research. That's a very important subject. And we need to kind of stop shifting towards this very closed source, unknown, having everything behind closed doors, because it's harmful towards research. And so we can kind of approach this by, once again, starting a conversation on the subject with friends, families, or loved ones, and getting involved with collective advocacy. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like, but we collectively do need to advocate for a better future for AI. And so, yeah, that's all. Any questions? And I guess we can start a discussion now. Oh, okay. Yeah, Johanna, I'll pass around the mic.
Hi. Yeah, great talk. Thank you. I love the aspect of your analysis of GPT. It was very holistic and emphasized sort of material concerns, environmental impacts, data privacy. So it's great. So my question is about the role of abstraction in computational research. It's really the bread and butter of computer science. But I think it's a big obstacle in terms of us engaging with Indigenous ontologies. I'm thinking about very basic assumptions like independence, statistical independence of data points, kind of blocking the view of data subjects as being in relation to one another. So I was just curious if you have any thoughts on abstraction.
Well, I mean, yeah, abstraction always has its uses, and so it really depends on the needs of what you're working on. Sometimes it is important to look at the interconnectedness, but other times other relations can kind of come up from looking at the bigger picture. And I think abstraction is a valuable tool and it has its place, and it's always kind of harmful to look at things as either being bad or good. There's times and places where abstraction would be greatly beneficial, especially if you want to reduce complexity in terms of whatever system you're working on. And so really, like any good answer, I would say it depends.
Thank you. Yeah, really great talk. Especially love the native land to show the diversity of Indigenous peoples. Really, really creative. I'm not an AI guy, but I do see a big problem emerging, and that's to do with these systems in sort of reinforcing and perpetuating misinformation about Indigenous peoples and culture. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue, and it's an issue that has been facing Indigenous people before these technologies existed. A really good example that I can think of this is, for example, I about a half a year ago went to New York and learned a lot about the Indigenous peoples there. And it's a very common misconception that the Dutch traders who landed in Manhattan bought the island of Manhattan for $26 nowadays. And so information like this is just spread all over the internet, right? This kind of misinformation, and common misconceptions can really spread, and that's a problem with a model that just scrapes the entire internet. Is there's going to be tons of anomalies, and unfortunately, Indigenous peoples aren't really involved in rooting out misinformation. So these models will be definitely a big problem for spreading misinformation on Indigenous peoples in particular, considering that the source materials are at best misleading.
I have a few questions, if that's okay. First one was related to the hardware environmental issues. Mm-hmm. Do you know if there's any programs or systems that like grade manufacturers on the supply chain ethics or that kind of thing? Like we had Lenovo here for a discussion on purchasing hardware some time ago, and they talked a little bit about like environmental concerns. But then I'm just thinking in terms of like the precious metal mining that's done in like slave labor and, you know, parts of the world and all that. Like, do you know if there's any systems that like push for that kind of thing?
I'm not aware of any system, and to be honest, I'm a little bit doubtful that such a system would be able to be implemented. I know from an architect's perspective, even finding architecture materials that are ethically sourced is a very difficult challenge, and those are much simpler resources than what we're dealing with at a computer level. And so it might something like that might exist, or it might just be on paper. But I feel like a lot of these programs would, even like the largest producers of computer chips, would not really change their ways unless there was a massive systemic change or pressure to force them to change, basically.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, then the only solution really is just reducing usage in general, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, we need data centers. We need to run this somewhere, but any data center is going to have unethically sourced materials, so just don't do it.
Yeah, that's kind of the tricky part, is how do we address this issue? And there definitely could be a way to sustainably source these materials, but it just needs a complete overhaul of this.
Yeah, like carbon credits, but that actually work.
Yeah,
kind of thing. Okay, another question I have is, you were talking about data and how the Indigenous data is just, there's so little of it. That's good data. Like, how do we push for data that's like anti-racist, anti-colonial? Because like I looked at the FNIGC, you know, I thought there's like a data center, and I'm not qualified to say if it's like enough data or something, right? But I mean, like GPT is trained on a ton of data. Like, how do you create more good data? How do you like get this going so that you can just use good data and, you know, not just propagate the world's biases by using the world's data?
Yeah, so the best way of getting good Indigenous data is to work with Indigenous communities and just get it from the source. A good example of this in the natural language processing world is there's actually a complete parallel corpus from Inuktitut, one of the languages spoken by the Inuit, and English. And so that's been a work that I don't remember exactly what the council is called up there, but the Nunavut Council, basically, they've had their recordings all transcribed and everything. And so they've worked with the National Research Council to basically develop that. And so it's just working with communities to make sure that the data is actually kind of demonstrative of the realities of their livelihoods, or whatever you would like it to be emblematic of.
Okay, thanks. That's all. Good talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hello. So I'm not a machine learning guy. I am an AI guy. We have a company where we've built an AI, a conversational AI, on a knowledge base, which is a very different system than machine learning. It's very prescriptive. You put data in the knowledge base, and then you ask for it to come out, basically, right, conversationally. But my question is maybe a little bit like the last two questions on abstraction. Is it even feasible to consider that you build a middle layer of machine learning processing, but you put the data comes from various communities, so distributed data. And if the Indigenous people want to have Indigenous answers, they go after that corpus, and other people are going after another corpus. I'm not sure whether that even makes any sense. Typically, the data is all in one big, massive corpus, right? Is there any thought around distributed data?
Yeah, so the abstraction of machine learning and stuff like that can definitely be beneficial, kind of as I was mentioning before, and it really depends on how you do it. For example, if you were to have some corpus that was serving some chatbot or whatever, you could definitely have it arranged so that it's ethical and that you minimize hallucinations and misinformation. And so it's definitely possible. It just really would take a lot of effort from the developer side to properly address those issues on a technical side. So I think whether it be like separate models, or if you combine them, or if you find a good way to combine them, it really just is a technical question of what works best in implementation. And it's really difficult to say right now. But as long as you put in like a concerted effort to work with these communities and get their validation, like ongoing consent, I think that's what's really important here, is just trying to work within an ethical lens. And yeah.
We have a couple questions online.
Yep.
Diana is asking, do you recall any past AI projects that have incorporated the principles you mentioned during your presentation?
So I have not personally worked on any projects that have been kind of incorporating these ideas that I discussed about. I do actually have a resource somewhere that kind of mentions some ethical Indigenous softwares, but it's pretty limited. I think there's only a handful that I know of that are usually like from the Pacific Islands, because they are very closely integrated with their Indigenous populations there. I believe there's also a group called Kama AI that's pretty good. Oh, okay, yeah. And there you go. So yeah.
But it's not a machine learning system.
Yeah.
Okay, one more online, the long one. So from Alan, what are your thoughts on balancing desire for open research, i.e. you reference public interest versus hostile nation states, e.g. counter-argument that it has been asserted that open research means that hostile nation states can leapfrog their own development of AI for nefarious purposes, e.g. political coercion, social control, weapons development, etc.
Well, that is an interesting point, and that is definitely something that has to be addressed. And like any good answer, you can't just have just open research or just closed research. But generally considering the fact that these models they rely on so much hardware and data that realistically, like having a nation leapfrog you is more of a feat of data than the architecture. At least that's my own personal belief. And a lot of those concerns are kind of difficult to address just because we don't really know what the future of AI is going to be like. And so if you were to work on like a top secret military AI or something like that, yeah, you definitely would want to keep that pretty locked up. But it is a balance. And in general, we're seeing more of the large public-facing models be very closed off, like ChatGPT, which I think is, definitely a bit questionable and unethical, and definitely brings concern.
Thank you so much, Cameron, and thank you everyone who worked to organize this and everyone who traveled from the way to come here. Great talk. I wanted to ask more about the collection of data and the demand for data and how those go hand in hand and how we can best involve Indigenous decision makers and individuals themselves in the collection of data and balance that with the demand for data that is generative AI and other initiatives that are similar. Is the demand lessening consumption of those models and of those services? What's your perspective on that?
Well, it's really tricky. I don't think that consumption is really driving it. There's basically this concept, and I'm just going to very briefly summarize it, of like, I don't remember exactly what it's called, but basically there's mass storage of data regardless of our consumption, just from these large tech companies, namely because they're hoping to store onto our personal encrypted data until technology lapses it so that they can crack that encryption so that they can view the personal data. And so I don't think that any amount of reducing personal consumption of these models would really address those issues unless we completely boycotted the internet. And how to kind of address the need for Indigenous data, it's a really difficult conversation because on one hand, it's very expensive and prohibitive. And also, I don't even know how these models source their data. Like, for example, ChatGPT can translate to a bunch of Indigenous languages, but like there's no public data sets available for that. So it just really raises more questions than answers. And so I'm really not sure. And I'm not even sure how like OpenAI does it right now. It's just confusing and mildly concerning. So I really, that's all I can kind of say on this subject.
Comment that your presentation was very good. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. As we know, like a lot of the language models, like ChatGPT, there's a lot of like bias that people have found in them, like gender, race, etc. I wonder, like, what are your thoughts on specifically how do we like identify the bias towards Indigenous people, and like how can we maybe mitigate that bias?
Well, it's very difficult to come up with a framework for this, especially because it's very new in nature. But it's basically finding, my understanding, because I've kind of took a little bit of a look on developing a framework for this, is my own thesis research. It's a very difficult question to answer because you have to be very systematic on how you approach it. But you would basically just want to ask it certain questions. I know that's how they basically did it to expose the gender and race biases. And so you would just need something kind of custom fitted towards Indigenous people to kind of address that. And then you would just have to produce a series of tests basically by hand and kind of, I guess, discuss the results pretty openly and share all of the responses you got. That would be how I would approach an ethical analysis of ChatGPT.
I'm wondering how we can balance fatigue of Indigenous groups and individuals in the demands and asks from them with our desire to collect data that is reflective of their perspective and worldview. What's your perspective on that?
I think that, yeah, there's definitely is like a fatigue of, as you kind of mentioned, of Indigenous peoples, you know, they're being asked for their advice, but like people aren't often listening. And so I think that's the important part, is actually listening, hearing and addressing some of the concerns and issues brought up, and just making sure to, when you're dealing with Indigenous people, being empathetic as possible, you know, and just treating them like people, I think is the most important part to kind of address this missing data portion, and just working with communities, being open and honest.